So today is an exciting day. We'll talk about planning and uncertainty. And it really puts together some of the material we talked about in past classes. We talked about planning, but not on uncertainty. And we had many classes on uncertainty. And now we get to the point where we can make decisions under uncertainty. This is really important from our own research field, like robotics, where the world is full of uncertainty. And the type techniques I'll tell you about today will really make it possible to drive robots in actual physical worlds and find good plans for these robots to execute. Planning under uncertainty. In this class so far, we talked a good deal about planning. We talked about uncertainty and probabilities. And we also talked about learning. But all three items were discussed separately. We never brought planning and uncertainty together, uncertainty and learning, or planning and learning. So in the class today, we'll fuse planning and uncertainty using techniques known as Markov decision processes, or MDPs, and partially observable Markov decision processes, or PAMDPs. We also have a class coming up on reinforcement learning, which combines all three of these aspects, planning, uncertainty, and machine learning. You might remember in the very first class, we distinguished very different characteristics of agent tasks, and here are some of those. We distinguished deterministic versus stochastic environments, and we also talked about fully observable versus partially observable. In the area of planning so far, all of our algorithms fall into this field over here, like A star, depth first, breadth first, and so on. The MDP algorithms, which I will talk about first, fall into the intersection of fully observable yet stochastic. And just to remind us what the difference was, stochastic is an environment where the outcome of an action is somewhat random, whereas an environment is deterministic when the outcome of an action is predictable and always the same. The environment is fully observable if we can see the state of the environment, which means we can make all decisions based on the momentary sensor input, whereas if we need memory, it's partially observable. Planning in the partially observable case is called PAMDP, and towards the end of this class, I'll briefly talk about PAMDPs, but not in any depth. So most of this class focuses on Markov decision processes as opposed to partially observable Markov decision processes. So what is a Markov decision process? One way you can specify a Markov decision process by a graph. Suppose you have states S1, S2, and S3, and you have actions A1 and A2. Then a state transition graph like this is a finite state machine, and it becomes Markov if the outcomes of actions are somewhat random. So for example, if A1 over here with a 50% probability leads to state S2, but with another 50% probability leads to state S3. So put differently, a Markov decision process has of states, actions, a state transition matrix, often written in the following form, which is just about the same as a conditional state transition probability that a state S prime is the correct posterior state after executing action A in a state S. And the missing thing is the objective for the Markov decision processes, what do we want to achieve. For that, we often define a reward function. And for the sake of this lecture, I will attach rewards just to states. So each state will have a function R attached that tells me how good the state is. So for example, it might be worth $10 to be in the state over here, $0 to be in the state over here, and $100 to be in the state over here. So the planning problem is now the problem which tries to assign an action to each possible state so that we maximize our total reward. Before diving into too much detail, let me explain you why MDPs really matter. What you see here is a robotic tour guide that the University of Bonn, with my assistants, deployed in the German Museum in Bonn. And the objective of this robot was to navigate to the museum and guide visitors, mostly kids, from exhibit to exhibit. This is a challenging planning problem because as the robot moves, it can't really predict its action outcomes because of the randomness of the environment and the carpet and the wheels of the robot. The robot is not able to really follow its own commands very well. And it has to take this into consideration during the planning process so when it finds itself at a location it didn't expect, it knows what to do. In the second video here, you see a successor robot that was deployed in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in the late 1990s, where it guided many, many thousands of kids through the entrance hall of the museum. And once again, this is a challenging planning problem. As you can see, people are often in the way of the robot. The robot has to take detours. Now, this one is particularly difficult because there were obstacles that were invisible, like a downward staircase. So there's a challenging localization problem trying to find out where you are, but that's for a later class. In the video here, you see a robot we deployed in a nursing home with the objective to assist elderly people by guiding them around, bringing them to appointments, reminding them to take their medication, and interacting with them. And this robot has been active for many, many years and been used. And again, it's a very challenging planning problem to navigate to this elderly home. And the final robot I'm showing you here was built with my colleague Brad Whitaker at Carnegie Mellon University. The objective here was to explore abandoned mines. Pennsylvania and West Virginia and other states are heavily mined. There's many abandoned old coal mines. And for many of these mines, it's unknown what the conditions are and where exactly they are. They're not really human accessible. They tend to have roof fall and very low oxygen levels. So we built a robot that went inside and built maps of those mines. All these problems have in common that they have really challenging planning problems. The environments are stochastic, that is, the outcome of actions are unknown, and the robot has to be able to react to all kinds of situations, even the ones that it didn't plan for. Let me give a much simpler example, often called Grid World for MDPs. And I'll be using this insanely simple example over here throughout this class. Let's assume we have a starting state over here, and there's two goal states, who are often called absorbing states, with a very different reward or payout. Plus 100 for the state over here, minus 100 for the state over here. And our agent is able to move about the environment, and when it reaches one of those two states, the game is over and the task is done. Obviously, the top state is much more attractive than the bottom state with minus 100. Now, to turn this into an MDP, let's assume actions are somewhat stochastic. So suppose we're in a grid cell, we attempt to go north. The deterministic agent would always succeed to go to the north square if it's available. But let's assume that we only have an 80% chance to make it to the cell in the north. If there's no cell at all, there's a wall like over here, we assume with 80% chance we just bounce back to the same cell. But with 10% chance, we instead go left. Another 10% chance we go right. So if an agent is over here and wishes to go north, then with 80% chance it finds itself over here, 10% over here, 10% over here. If it goes north from here, because there's no north cell, it'll bounce back with 80% probability, 10% left, 10% right. In a cell like this one over here, it'll bounce back with 90% probability, 80 from the top and 10 from the left, but it still has a 10% chance of going right. This is a stochastic state transition which we can equally define for actions south, west, and east. And now we can see in a situation like this, conventional planning is insufficient. So for example, if we plan a sequence of actions starting over here, we might go north, north, east, east, east to reach our plus 100 absorbing or final state. But with this state transition model over here, even in the first step, it might happen with 10% chance that we find ourselves over here, in which case conventional planning would not give us an answer. So we wish to have a planning method that provides an answer no matter where we are. And that's called a policy. A policy assigns actions to any state. So for example, a policy might look as follows. For this state, we wish to go north, north, east, east, east. But for this state over here, we wish to go north, maybe east over here, maybe west over here. So each state, except for the absorbing states, we have to define an action to define a policy. The planning problem, therefore, becomes one of finding the optimal policy. To understand the beauty of a policy, let me look into stochastic environments, and let me try to apply conventional planning. Consider the same grid I just gave you. And let's assume there's a discrete start state, the one over here, and we wish to find an action sequence that leads us to the goal state over here. In conventional planning, we would create a tree. In C1, we're given 4 action choices, north, south, west and east. However, the outcome of those choices is non-deterministic. So rather than having a single outcome, nature will choose for us the actual outcome. In the case of going north, for example, we may find ourselves in B1 or back into C1. Similarly, for going south, we might find ourselves in C1 or back in C2, and so on. This tree has a number of problems. The first problem is the branching factor. While we have 4 different action choices, nature will give us up to 3 different outcomes, which makes up to 12 different things we have to follow. Now, in conventional planning, we might have to follow just one of those, but here we might have to follow up to 3 of those things. So every time we plan a step ahead, we might have to increase the breadth of the search tree by at least a factor of 3. So one of the problems is the branching factor is too large.